This has been a real enjoyable experience over the last 2 years working with the Collaborative Institute as we have prepared for and planned for this plenary and specifically the work to put the science and the strategy and policy tracks together has introduced me to a number of people that I wouldn't have had an opportunity to interact with before. And to represent Battelle in this enterprise, along with associates from Battelle, has been reflective of our commitment corporately to furthering the need for science, research, and development, and furthering the imperative for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education. And so with that as a brief introduction, there were three things that kind of stuck out in my mind as I went through the experience of the last 3 days. One is that the facts of climate change and ocean change are fairly well agreed to at this point, and that's a substantial improvement of circumstance from where we were 3 to 5 years ago, where the fact that the oceans and the climate were changing was still being hotly debated. I think being a retired naval officer, one of the areas that I take pride in is that the Navy has been amongst the most forward of the government agencies in accepting that, in fact, the climates and ocean are changing and that we need to do something different as a result of that change. There's uncertainty about the range of possible futures that these changes portend, and I think that range of uncertainty brings with it both an obligation to take action anyways, but to meter that action based on what will be good in the long term as the science and the understanding continue to develop. The range of possible futures implies by itself a risk that we as a society, we as a civilization, need to be willing to understand and take action within the realms of that range of risk. Where we choose to act relative to that fairly broad band of potential outcomes will either increase the risk that we actually absorb or reduce the risk, in which case the balance between acceptable risk and over-resourcing to avoid a risk that never develops will be a part of the conversation. That's not a simple conversation. This isn't a simple set of relationships that we're discussing. And we can't have the conversation on a national or a global scale without an educated populace that understands the science behind the changes and the risks that are associated with them. That education of our populace, I think, needs to be front and center in the efforts that we walk away from as being required, because the decisions need to be based on the best science that's available today to do something today, and the best science that becomes available through future years, which will modify or change the plans that we put in place. Policy is sometimes a bad word, and it falls oftentimes in the press as being something that you work against. But we desperately need the right policies, and we need the right policies at the local level. We need the right policies within our individual organizations, whether they're academic, industrial, or governmental. And we need the right policies at a national and even at a global scale. Again, those policies have to be based on science. And we can't look at policy as being a bad word. We have to train ourselves to take responsibility for the policies at each of those levels and prepare ourselves to provide the best policies possible. And the last point is, without having that fluency, that understanding of the risks, the policies in place that are based on that, we can't begin the critical work of planning for a future that will be either brighter or darker than the present. I would hold out the opportunity that the change allows could be it could be on the positive end of the range of opportunities. It could be on the negative end of the range of opportunities. But we need to start planning today for major changes that will occur 5, 10, 15 years from now. We need to be planning for where the population centers will shift. We need to plan for where we'll shift our industrial base. We'll need to plan for transportation corridors. Gosh, there's so much planning that needs to take place. We can't hold off on that until the science is perfect. And I think that we've had an opportunity to discuss that for the last 3 days. Thank you. Should we just go down the line?
Sure.
We five and others agreed to be on the Council of Advisors for the Collaborative Institute because we saw this intersection between oceans, climate, and security as something unique and important to spend time and energy focusing on. We've obviously heard a lot about the military in the last couple of days, but I want to remind everyone, and we reminded ourselves in discussing before this plenary panel, that the word security here is not just about national military force type security. It is about food security. It's about, as someone here said, security is the freedom from anxiety. It's is your community going to be wiped out by a coastal storm event as a result of climate change, and how do we deal with all of those aspects? We're certainly inspired by policy set by the Secretary of Navy that is intended to save the lives of Marines in fuel convoys, reduce the vulnerability by addressing the cost of fuel and access to fuel supplies, as well as to increase the readiness of the military by enhancing its speed, range, reach, reliability, and in the case of the India Company, stealth, because their generators aren't making noise in the field. But I think the other piece that we didn't mention of the inspiration here is that most of us find climate change an overwhelming proposition to deal with, particularly as individuals. It takes the accumulation of many, many individual actions to address climate change, and we know that that's possible. And so the inspirational piece here that I think is interesting is the scale that we're talking about when we're talking about the Department of Defense use of fossil fuels and the potential of reduction of those fossil fuel uses as a form of mitigation. This will be an actual reduction in emissions. We also can see that the other definitions of security would allow us to do mitigation in the form of restoration of coastal ecosystems, seagrass meadows, mangroves, and the like, that would help us prevent storm surges, while at the same time offering opportunities to increase the ocean's carbon sink capacity. So if we think of this bit of climate change adaptation and mitigation and the potential for the military to be a catalyst in forcing change, and I'll use the small f of forcing as opposed to military force, when they set out to ask a vendor to produce a new propulsion system for a ship or an airplane, or to deal with a different kind of fuel, or to produce a different kind of fuel, they are forcing change. Now, we've mentioned that maybe this is the way change is going to happen and that we don't need to change policy, given that we currently are lacking, shall we say, in political will when it comes to talking about climate change. And so the other inspiration piece here is all of those other factors that the military has chosen to consider are paralleled by any of our other industries, any of our communities. If we're dealing with climate change and making sure we're alleviating people's anxiety, as that definition of security, the same things that Admiral Mavis mentioned of saving lives, saving money, reducing vulnerability have to be the definitional things that get our political will to take those actions, and we don't even necessarily have to speak about climate change. But to get there, I think we have to figure out how to condition the public view. The people are not prepared for this conversation. They are certainly not prepared to change their personal values. And so we need to decide that this information that we all have is necessary but not sufficient. We need communication and outreach. We need adequate data sharing, open source of data. We need to make sure science is accessible. We need to make sure things like the Navy's 100-year data set on sea level rise is known, and known that it comes from the Navy, and known that it is out there. It's kind of inexcusable that this is not already widely known. And we can say the same thing for any other physical or chemical change in oceanography that goes forward. And how do any of those things, whether it has to do with the cost savings, savings in lives, or reducing vulnerability, how do they translate into economic incentives, legal enforcement incentives, risk reductions, and care about the generations who follow us? Thank you very much.
I have 5 or 6 observations in no particular order of importance and perhaps somewhat redundant, but I wanted to begin by thanking all of you, including those my colleagues on the panel, because I think, like all of you, I've learned a lot over the last 3 days, and that's the ultimate compliment to an urban research university convening a conference as ambitious as this. I think we've been respectful of one another. We've talked across disciplines and traditional silos, and I sense that most of us came willing and eager to learn from one another, and I certainly learned a great deal from you. For the last 4 or 5 years, I've been dean of the Drucker School of Management at the Claremont Colleges. Some of you may know of Peter Drucker's work. He's the father of modern management theory and considered himself a social ecologist, which may be an appropriate metaphor for thinking about the topics of oceans, climate, and security. So I'm going to invoke Drucker a little bit in my 5 or 6 observations, or at least in a couple of them. The first is that Drucker said he wasn't a futurist, but he looked out the window and could see what was visible but not yet seen. What's visible but not yet seen? And I think this conference has illuminated, at least for me and through my eyes, an enormous amount of energy, science, curiosity, and creativity that's already present in this space, well beyond what I think any of us knew in isolation from one another is taking place. Amidst the uncertainty, not waiting for the data gaps to be filled, many are taking action, almost as a precautionary step. From NOAA Oh, I lost my notes. There we go. Let's see if I can power up. From NOAA to the Navy to coastal zone action plans in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Maine. From a green Navy to green river schools to task forces on the Arctic. This is very encouraging, very inspiring. And if we do nothing from this conference other than to open the kimono, so to speak, and celebrate and educate some of the public to some of these successes, we will have moved the needle, begun to move the needle, and the needle needs to move dramatically. Secondly, while we've had some spirited debate as a panel in thinking about our observations, I'm one who thinks that this reframing of the issue, linking global warming, oceans, and security, and perhaps Captain Porter's right that national security needs to be amended to include national prosperity so that it's not simply and exclusively identified as a military concern. But I think this reframing has profound implications, and the role that the Navy in particular, and we didn't hear from the Army, my sense would be they're doing equally thrilling things, but the role of the U.S. military, which has been a force for good in our society over many decades and centuries. I mean, we wouldn't have an integrated society unless there had been the 82nd Airborne in Little Rock, Arkansas, and we wouldn't have had integration at all unless Harry Truman had pulled the trigger, so to speak, and integrated the force after World War II. We shouldn't put too much of a burden on the military, but thank the Lord that they have stepped up to the plate, again, as a precautionary measure, perhaps, and exercised leadership, which, as an exemplar. And this is, I think, a game changer for this whole topic, because in a society where every institution in our society is facing the threat and the reality of plummeting confidence, the U.S. military is still the most trusted institution in our society. So when Mike Mullen, then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, got up in front of Congress and he said that the most significant threat to our national security is our debt, the nation listened. And when the Secretary of the Navy gets up and he says, this is not an ideological positioning, I'm not an advocate, I'm just doing what's in our national security's best interest. That's why I'm floating a green Navy. Well, again, we shouldn't minimize the debt we owe to the U.S. military and the opportunity that it gives us as a society to reframe this issue. Third, I kept hearing from the systems thinker, and I think we need more systems thinking about this topic generally, that obviously we're either viewing these as threats or opportunities, as threat multipliers, or what I would introduce as force multipliers, to use a military metaphor. There's enormous leverage through collaboration, communication, partnership, this new narrative that we're beginning, this new algorithm that's developing can help us accelerate and take advantage of this as an opportunity, and not to minimize the threat. A fourth observation, I'll go back to Drucker for a moment. He said that in looking at global problems that seem intractable and insoluble, there's another way of viewing them, and he said each and every one of them is a business opportunity. If we'll simply, not simply, but if we were to focus our entrepreneurial energies, our intellectual innovation, and view problems as opportunities and harness markets and the profit incentive, we can make dramatic progress. So again, in the context of opportunities, not just threats, I think business is underrepresented at this first global conference, which I think otherwise is a great success. And I think our second global conference should have a much greater participation and involvement, not only of maybe next year the Army as well as the Navy and the Air Force, but you'll forgive the expression, also Unilever and Walmart and other folks who have capital in a constrained society, they're as much at risk as any other sector, and they should be represented. Fifth observation, and then I'm almost there. I think it was, I can't remember who it was, Clemenceau, who said that war is too important to be left to the generals. I listened to NOAA Administrator Lubchenco. She described our oceans as becoming warmer, higher, stormier, more acidic than ever before. I think these issues are too important to be left to NOAA or to the Navy. They need to be entrusted to the people in a democracy, and we need to let the public into this conversation. And I think they would be inspired by the example, the science, the insights, the passion. But if we want to unlock and unleash and harness the energies of our people in a free society, then they have to be much more central to this conversation. I'll conclude not with really an observation of our work, but just a little inspiration that I take from Drucker. He said he didn't predict the future, but the best way to predict the future is to create it. And I have a sense that in this emerging conversation, in this confluence across sectors, those of you who are passionate about oceans, those of you who are advocates for climate change, those of you who defend us through the military, there's increasing energy about not only acknowledging the reality of the intractable problems that we face, but creating a future that harnesses those multiple disciplines and energies to create a more favorable and positive and secure and prosperous future. Thank you.
I'll just follow on to many of these same things, but because I kicked the conference off here on Tuesday morning, and I asked that we maybe take a much broader definition of security and prosperity, so not just freedom from anxiety for security, but well-being for prosperity. And I've listened to the conversations and the discussions, which I found quite helpful as well over the last 2 days. It occurred to me that there's something that I think about a lot that is actually something that you should all consider as well. And that is that my sense is that we tend to associate resilience with security. So resilience is being able to take a gut punch and get back up. But that doesn't get you going in any particular direction. It just means you're able to get back up. So security alone isn't enough to provide for the sustainability of our economy. They're interrelated. I think sustainability is related more closely to prosperity. So if you think of how interdependent those two concepts are and how they have come up repeatedly in the discussions you've had, I think you recognize that we need both resilience and sustainability because they support each other. They're both requirements. So that would be my number one observation, that we try to think maybe a little more in those terms, particularly from a values-based perspective with opportunities in mind, not risk and threat. Those are my personal, very strong feelings. So what I was going to do is I was going to give you, I only have 3 of these, I was going to give you a line that you guys gave us in response to the priorities that I would equate or that I think represents that. So this concept of resilience and sustainability, one of the groups suggested under priorities, we need better tools for helping populations deal with transition away from past community norms to new community norms. And this is all about, in my opinion, this is all about looking forward instead of looking back. So I think that's a very important thing to consider. The next piece that I would offer, this little pearl of wisdom, is something else that I talk about a lot, and that's the need for less focus on entitlement and more focus on enlightenment. And it leads me to another major takeaway from the suggestions you provided, and that's education. I think education is the #1 priority for tackling and for tackling the challenges and seizing the opportunities inherent in a new strategic environment. I just can't stress this strongly enough. And it's not just STEM, it's recognizing a systemic approach to education is every bit representative of the way we need to understand the strategic ecosystem in which we live. So one of the bullets that we had under priorities for education was the need for more or better K through 12 education for the next generation. You make lifelong citizens, but also get to parents through their kids. Amen. I mean, I think that was an adroit suggestion. The third point I wanted to make has been stated previously by everyone on the panel, so it obviously is something that has resonated with a lot of people. I think I have a slightly different take on it, but it's that the military has a role to demonstrate the efficacy of more sustainable energy practices. We have a pulpit from which to demonstrate the value of these sustainable and alternative sources of energy. That doesn't mean we have the lead on that. I think that we should leverage the messaging that the military is able to provide, recognizing that the military, it is not their mandate to take the lead on this. They should support a strong citizenry who wants to do this. In that vein, I think one of the strongest metaphors that we have in the future that we can seize on, and it's very powerful, and that's, I wanted to bring it up. The whole point of naming this the Great Green Fleet and deploying it, I think it's in 2016, and deploying it globally, is to contrast where we are today in this strategic environment from where we were in the early 1900s when the Great White Fleet demonstrated American force and gunboat diplomacy. What I think Secretary Mabus and the Navy is trying to say is that we recognize we're in a different strategic environment, it's interdependent, and we all have converging interests in a more sustainable future. I think it's a very powerful message, and I would encourage you to leverage that. But the truth is, this doesn't belong, as I said, to the military. It doesn't just belong to the private sector, but I agree completely that was what was missing, really, was a strong presence from large corporations who need to buy into this. It doesn't just belong to the public sector. It belongs to American citizens. I mean, that was well said. I believe that. I said in a conversation earlier, I appreciate the fact that everyone supports the military. My son's a Marine. I appreciate that. I want a bumper sticker that says, I support the American citizen, because you're the ones who have the lead on this, and we should only be reflecting the finest characteristics that you represent to the rest of the world. And I think for all of our international participants here, they recognize that America has a leadership role to play, and I think they would be happy to join us if we would demonstrate the leadership to do that. So the third example from that was that there needs to be more communication across fields, cross sectors, academia, military policy, health, economics, industry, insurance, fishing, education, media, and food security. That kind of sums it up. So those were the three priorities. I just picked 4 bullets that I thought were good that you had all offered for strategy, and you deserve to hear those too. Integrated models of the terrestrial and coastal zones to illustrate connections between the two for effective management. Development of national energy goals. We need a clear direction. Broaden the network of trusted communicators, scientists, teachers, leaders, meteorologists, faith-based organizations. Amen. Change the argument from science and politics to economics. I think those are all very valuable inputs, and I really appreciated your participation and joining in the dialogue.
Thank you very much, Captain Porter, and thanks for the remarks that were given by all of the panelists. Does anybody on the panel have anything that they would like, any point that another panelist made that they would like to pick up on or embellish? If not, we do have time, so I think What we should do is see if there are questions or comments from the attendees. You can either direct it to one of the panelists for a response or make a comment on something that you've heard or has caused you to reflect upon after you've heard it in this conference. Do we have anybody who's interested in doing that? Yes, you know.
Start us off. I was really struck by what Mark started to talk about in terms of the enormous credibility that the military carries in our society, and I think that's something that's very underlooked in terms of communications, raising awareness on science and climate change and ocean issues. But I also very much appreciate Porter's closing statement, the humility of acknowledging that the military doesn't wag the dog. And the military, I just want to repeat what you said because I appreciate it so much, should reflect the finest characteristics of a society. And I think we all aim to reflect the finest characteristics, but that's what really brings us together, is this vision and this belief, especially, I mean, let's face it, we're predominantly an American audience, but I think that this belief that we can change things. Yes, we've made mistakes, we've screwed up the planet, we've screwed up the weather, but we fundamentally believe, our dream is that we can fix it, and that injustice, inequity, that these things are actually, they have always been intolerable, they will remain intolerable, and the injustice and inequity of global climate change, the repercussions of our actions, not just on our own society, but on global society, we need to remind ourselves that we don't tolerate this as a people.
Thank you.
Yeah, you probably said it better than any of us could, but de Tocqueville, to paraphrase, said, "America's a great country because Americans are good citizens." And I think the takeaway from Secretary Mabus and Captain Porter and others is correct, that the military should not be leading this parade, no pun intended, but what they've done is to internalize into their DNA a set of operating principles that capture the values that they're supposed to represent. And all of our institutions should be similarly incorporating into their DNA the equivalent of a Green Navy.
And Fred, I think you...
Yeah, I wanted to bring up a point that was made to me by Dr. Alfred Ohlers, who was here from the Hawaii Pacific Center. I don't see him in the audience right now. Which is, and this is kind of patting ourselves on the back, but you know, we have a tradition and a history of an awfully ugly political system that works from the local level to the regional level to the state level to the national level, and of somehow being able to harness that to come up with a coherent forward motion that has really, in my mind, been unequaled by other national entities. And that, I can't think of a situation where if you have a more complex problem, that isn't the way that you want to approach things. That you want to get all of those levels of responsibility, levels of communication and delegation involved, to where you mix it all up and you come up with a solution with everybody's thoughts engaged, not necessarily everybody agreeing with what the solution is, and that history, that ability that we've shown to do that, is really why we should be leading this on the international stage at the end. Because who else can do it? Who else can work with that type of diverse thought, and who else can work with that type of multiple inputs and adroitly pull it together into a common purpose? And so I just wanted to remember what Dr. Ohlers told me, and I think it's true, that we are by rights the international leader for this because we're best at handling complex situations by the very nature that we talk about them. And we just got to get more information out so more people can talk to it. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? I do see a hand. Yes, ma'am. Mhm. Yep, Val. You're right in the line of the spotlight. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Jack. So as a follow-up to what you just said, I've felt all along in this meeting that what's missing is the city and town and neighborhood level of conversation. Because a lot of the themes you have are topics maybe are arguably fairly well represented in this kind of technology-based bureaucracy and science. But until you get down to where people or citizens experience things directly, which is where they live and the communities that they know of neighbors in their towns, particularly the coastal ports, actually, that experiencing the land and ocean interface, I don't think you're going to really understand how to move forward or have that political base to really change things. So I'm from Gloucester, Massachusetts. I mean, it's a prime example of getting the right sectors, new governance, doing education outreach, partnerships, looking at the economics and planning. I think this field needs desperately to go into real live communities and sort through the implications and opportunities going forward of these threats from climate and other issues, economic and sustainability, et cetera. So I would strongly encourage an emphasis on bringing experts into real live American communities, not just reaching a citizen through an ad campaign. But and the motto you used, this has been the strength historically, and it's missing now in a whole broad range of areas. It's certainly missing in this one. Get down into American communities. I see papers that have Gloucester in them, and no one in Gloucester knows they're in these planning studies. That's a big problem. It's missing the opportunity for insight, and it's also setting up America for a backlash when they understand that all this stuff is going on, planning for their future, and they don't even know about it. So it's both an opportunity to engage America in communities and also a way to really move the agenda forward politically.
I'll tell you, let
Thank
me
you, Valerie.
follow up on that real quick. I think one group that should have been here, to your point, and it's one group that I would encourage you to get involved in because I'm finding myself nationally dealing with this group a lot, and that is the mayors. So where do you make this happen? Where does the community meet policy in reality for people? It's through their mayors, really. So I'm finding myself dealing more and more with mayors as I go across the country. And wouldn't that have been a cool group to bring in so that you're not bringing, one person to a community that way, but you're bringing actually a whole community here and letting him or her understand what was said. I think it's a great point. And I would encourage you all to try to engage with your mayor. Try to get them involved in the city councils, et cetera.
Any other reaction? Somebody else had their hand up in the back. Matt?
Thank you. Several of the comments made me think about some of our discussion in the breakout session, which was that the U.S. is a leader internationally. But I'm just wondering if one of the panelists would like to do a thought experiment to say, what would happen if our White House actually was a little bit more bold? I understand why they're cautious right now in the political context, but what if they were more bold and made some stronger statements about global climate change? What would happen?
Can I?
Yeah.
Sure. One of the, I'm probably the last person in the world should be answering this question, so I'll just
No,
talk
I
to
think
you about,
I'm the last person in the world.
I'll just talk to you about one of the perspectives that came out of our discussion here and discussions in previous places. I was amazed by how much is happening without them being bolder. And I think this goes to the comment that the young lady made over here I think she was on the coastal zone management workshop that we had on the first afternoon. And that one kind of opened my eyes to how much is being done without the White House having to be more of the bully pulpit on this. Would I like them to be more of a bully pulpit? Yeah, I would. My personal opinion is I think this is an issue that is of national importance, and that our elected leadership at the national level should be unafraid of having a position on it and laying out a plan for it. But look how much has occurred at the coastal level in the New England area and other areas of the country without having that bully pulpit in place, because the people were engaged and they're doing the best they can with the information they have. And I think they could do a better job if they had better information and knew what each other were doing with a little bit more transparency.
I think if I were to encourage the administration to be more bold, I would tell them to pick their fights. And I would start with the Navy's 100 years of data on sea level rise. Uncontrovertible, reliable source, done. Go for it. Talk about it. I think it would be very difficult to attack the president on that. I think if the president talked about something less certain, it's going to have all the vultures descend and attack this as, more Euro-socialism, as somebody mentioned here at this meeting. I was at an event recently in which the vice president was asked exactly this question: why is this administration not being bold? And he gave a pretty compelling explanation of having to deal with what they were saddled with when they inherited this office, and what they've had to deal with regard to fighting wars and recovering from the second most devastating recession in the history of the United States. All of that is an explanation and not an excuse. I think there are people within the administration who would like to be more bold. I think there are others in the administration who advise against being bold for political reasons. And, they're not going to listen to me.
I was just going to pick up on these last two observations, including yours, Val. There is bold leadership locally. We heard from a representative of arguably the greenest mayor in America, Tom Menino, and we heard last night from the greenest governor in America, Deval Patrick. And this conference is being sponsored by an urban public research university here in Boston, facing out to the ocean, which the city is re-embracing after cleaning up what was the dirtiest harbor in America and is now the cleanest. The Charles River received a $250,000 recognition as the cleanest, most cleaned up river in the world this year because of citizen engagement. So I think the stars and the moon are aligned here in Boston to be a demonstration of exactly what you're talking about, Val, engaging community in not only education and recognition, but action that can be taken locally that's visible and has enormous economic and other opportunities as well. This could be the beta site. This could be ground zero for the paradigm that we're constructing nationally and hopefully globally.
Beautifully stated. Any other questions? Yes, right here in the front.
I'm Nan Johnson. I'm working with FEMA here as a community planner in Region 1. And I wanted to put in perspective some of the challenges that we're also facing when we look also at a program that's already there of a national directive trying to reduce risk, long-term risk, from natural disasters in this country. And I see that progress in a lot of the points that you're talking about. And we have the mechanisms. We are working with each community on reducing that risk, addressing there are hazards as far as natural disasters. That is expanding and going in the direction more and more of man-made hazards and now threats. So it's going to be interesting to see how that connects. But having this mechanism, we've been working with the public, we've been working local states and tribes and so on. The challenges we still face in that is the priority, the commitment and the priority still coming from the local communities. And I think that's still going to be our challenge because we have these mechanisms in place. I think it's going to be an interesting direction we're going to move forward with now hearing the military, because even for myself, and we had another female person, we're hearing now that connection. I think that's exciting to hear more of that connection, because down at the regional level, we really haven't, or I haven't been hearing that. And it's going to take another interesting perspective. But I mean, how we have that program, how are you having that dialogue with Craig Fugate and Homeland Security and FEMA to make those connections, to address that priority and that sense of, communities are taking the leads in stronger in some areas than others. And like you said, Boston is going to be an amazing model to see how they're addressing climate change. But I guess just continuing to share the challenge of getting it as a priority for communities and as a country as a whole. Based on a program a direction we've been trying to address. The cost of these disasters, as you know, is just we can't sustain that. So, thoughts on, not comparing, but where we've been, but where we're still going. And I think one thing that's helped us is that message of working with other agencies. And so we do have a partnership here in New England with the federal partners trying to come together. So they're not just hearing it from one agency, but it's a united voice that we're learning from each other and trying to come out with similar messages. So thank you for bringing your perspective. It's been interesting.
I think we have just a couple minutes. I'll take one more question. Steve. Oh, well, let's do two if you'll be quick. Go ahead, Steve.
I'm sorry, I've been sort of like saying hobby horses inside.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think there's a fundamental disconnect here. Your panel, the topics that you put up, well, the first one was science to inform decision making, and advocating that we must develop policies based on scientific findings. And Mr. Jackson observed that we must bring the public into the decision process. And I think these are fine, except for that the public is hardly likely to accept the recommendations of scientists when the public sphere, which is, as I see, a shrinking space for democratic deliberation, is increasingly colonized by economic interests that are quite willing to sacrifice long-term public goods in their pursuit of short-term profits, and have no scruples about spreading lies and disinformation in order to block any responsible climate policy. So, I think we're facing something much more severe than we need to educate people a little bit better. I think that we really are talking about, repairing the fabric of public argument and talking about even defending the idea of public anything when privatization is being offered as the solution to all our problems. So there's something much more, a much bigger problem here that I think your recommendations will address. I just had to say that.
Again, I don't want to get the last word in. I agree with everything you said. It underscores, and I know we don't want to put all of our eggs in Captain Porter's basket, but the fact that the United States Navy is taking this seriously, that the Secretary of the Navy stood before us and talked about commissioning a green fleet and saving $250 million $250 million over the life cycle of one boat in terms of energy consumption, and how this is in our national security interest. He's not doing it as a do-gooder. Gives us the opportunity for the American public to hear a voice of credibility that is trusted for the first time on these issues, just as Chairman Mullen talking about the national debt got a lot of people stopping and no longer throwing brickbats at one another and saying, oh, it's a national security concern. It changes everything. It has the potential of reframing the conversation.
Okay,
And
well,
I'll add, we at the Ocean Foundation are advising a ocean-centric investment portfolio. And so over the last 4 years, we've looked at 3,000 companies working in the various sectors, propulsion for ships, et cetera, as potential investments. And it's not just the Navy who's doing this. There are many in the private sector who are paying attention to this risk, who are designing solutions in their products and services, who are evaluating these risks as part of insurance and reinsurance. I think that we have investment groups who are looking at whether these companies who are not addressing these things are disclosing the risks that their products, services, and installations are exposed to in their SEC risk filings. This change is happening even if the political leaders aren't leading the change. And I think that we have to keep it reinforcing that over and over again every chance we get.
Peter, last question.
Last question. I want to go back to the topic list because I find it odd that some language in the context of what Mark was just saying is not in there about the sort of the correlative reallocation of existing limited resources as part of the strategy. I mean, if we just continue to follow the money the way the money flows conventionally, we'll continue to do conventional behavior. And so the Navy's 500 million leveraging another 500 million, which could leverage another 500 million from the oil companies who might want to get in on the deal. That's a reallocation or a financial incentive. And it seems to me that both in public and private money, there needs to be a correlative shift and alignment with these potential new goals that will enable us to achieve them. Why is that not missing in the topics or in the final statement?
I meant to suggest that Drucker's observation that every global challenge we face is a business opportunity in disguise is meant to suggest that by bringing other players to this table, the economic calculus can change fairly dramatically if we view this and if they view this as an opportunity and not as a zero-sum game.
I have one last thing to say, and that is, why don't we do it because it's the right thing to do? Isn't that what America's about?
Yeah, that'd be nice too.
Very good. I think that's a
last
great
word.
sentiment upon which we should conclude the panel. Would you all join me in thanking the... Thank you very much, Andy.
Okay, all right, great.
All right, before people pack up and leave, I'd like to say a few things, and then the provost would like to close this 2.5-day conference. So I just wanted to, again, thank all of you for coming and for staying through the third day up until 4:30. Your collective thinking has been recorded. The next step is that my colleagues and I will be writing a white paper that summarizes the gems from this conference. I may also be sending out an email to all of you, many of you, asking you to submit a paper or your thoughts that we can look at and potentially post on the CIOCS website or the GC12 website. We don't want the thinking to end right here at 5 o'clock. A lot of you have some new ideas. Maybe you've stimulated some conversations that you would like to continue, and we want to share in that. So you will be hearing from me. We have your email addresses. So I just want you to know that this is not the end of the conversation. This is the end of 2.5 days. But before you leave, I would like to once again introduce the provost. Here he comes. Provost Winston Langley, and I'm sure he has some pearls of wisdom to depart. Thank you.
As I sat and heard the distinguished panelists speak about the range of futures that we may face, adaptation and mitigation opportunities, prosperity and well-being, resilience and sustainability, education as a #1 priority, the reconstruction of the public sphere so that one may have adequate exchanges, I began to think about what this program sought to engage in, a conversation, and how well what I've heard fits into what we understand the conversation to be, and why I leave here very optimistic about some possibilities for our common and joint future. You know, one of the attributes of a conversation is that it does not compel any specific medium or idiom in its discourse. If we're going to solve the problems we face, we'll have to deal with multiple disciplines to be brought to bear on this problem. And so we cannot, in any wise, give preference to particular idioms. And that's part of what I heard. The conversation has no specific end to which it tends. And that's part of its creative vitality. Although we have an end we may envision, it's not compelled. When we speak of multiple futures, that's part of what it is. One can join the conversation at any juncture, and therefore it's democratic in character. Or it should be, because its structure takes in many, many, many components. And here I hear the claim that we must have the cities and the towns and the individual, the citizen. I will even say the species identity we have as humans, because we are humans before we are citizens. And that the conversation never ends. It continues, it enlightens. And I heard speaking of insights and creativity and the imaginative possibilities. That's what the conversation does. And so I hope we see this as part of a beginning of an elaborate conversation in which the work of the Navy, because of its importance in society, because of data it has that may not be easily be refuted, can help to structure that conversation for a common future. Thank you. The university is very happy to have had you. We are joint travelers to an end I hope we'll all embrace happily.